Hey everyone, I'm working to hit 1,000 subscribers and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy this content, please hit that subscribe button right now.
Welcome back, and today we need to talk about something critical happening with the Toronto Blue Jays right now. There are a couple of trades this organization could realistically make before spring training arrives, and we're not just throwing names out there for speculation purposes. There's a legitimate logjam developing in that outfield, and we're going to break down which players could actually be on the move. Whether we like these potential trades or not, they represent real possibilities if the Blue Jays want to pursue Bo Bichette or Kyle Tucker. Moves absolutely have to happen to create playing time and roster flexibility. Let's start with the elephant in the room, which is Kyle Tucker. He hasn't signed anywhere yet, but if the Blue Jays do inevitably land him, there becomes a significant logjam for this roster. A lot of people forget that Anthony Santander just spent most of last season on the injured list, but now that hopefully won't be the case walking into next year. That means there's suddenly a spot missing for somebody when you look at how the lineup projects. You've got Santander in there. You've got Vladimir Guerrero Jr. You've got Bo Bichette if he stays. You've got all the usual suspects filling out that everyday lineup. But there's no Dalton Varsho getting regular starts. There's no Nathan Lukes in that lineup consistently. There's no David Schneider getting everyday at-bats. There's no Miles Straw penciled in regularly, and there's no Joey Loperfido in that starting nine. None of those guys appear in the projected everyday lineup as it currently stands for the Blue Jays. That reality begs the question of whether it would actually be better for this team if they go out and acquire Kyle Tucker or bring back Bo Bichette, and then take one of those depth assets and move it to address another organizational need through trade. That's the critical question facing management right now. We looked at last year when Bichette was on the team, and you still saw some of those depth guys have pretty prominent roles, like Nathan Lukes getting significant playing time. But that was largely because of the George Springer injury creating unexpected opportunities. You could make an argument to yourself that maybe we don't trade those guys just in case of injury, which is totally valid reasoning. Depth is never a bad thing over a 162-game season. But if you do go get Kyle Tucker, that's an everyday player right there in right field or left field who's not coming out of the lineup under any circumstances. Then you've got a massive split between Dalton Varsho, Nathan Lukes, Miles Straw, Joey Loperfido, and David Schneider. That becomes a genuine headache for the coaching staff trying to keep everyone engaged and getting at bats. If they're not playing meaningful innings, you might as well extract some value from them and trade them for another piece, possibly a bullpen arm, or maybe some prospects or even cash considerations. It's kind of the same argument we've been having about Jose Berrios and roster construction philosophy. Depth is never a bad thing, fundamentally, and I'm never going to advocate for having less depth. But ultimately, you're talking about legitimately good baseball players who might not be playing as much as they should or would be playing significantly more on another organization's roster. The option exists for the Blue Jays right now to evaluate their depth and make difficult decisions. They don't even have Joey Loperfido on the projected 26-man roster right now, and he wasn't really on it last year because of various injuries throughout the season. But he played phenomenally for the Jays in his small sample size, and I believe his OPS was sitting just under 900 at 879, keeping in mind this represents just 96 at bats. You're looking at a young player like that and thinking, okay, there's legitimate flash in the pan potential here. Could he get another extended look to prove himself? The fact of the matter is, on the Toronto Blue Jays roster as currently constructed, there's simply not a spot for him to get that look right now. There would have to be multiple injuries for him to crack that everyday lineup. If you add Kyle Tucker to this roster, there would need to be even more injuries to get Loperfido into that lineup on a daily basis. For me, if I'm the Blue Jays front office, this is the number one player I'm looking at right now to potentially move. I know many fans out there love Joey Loperfido. We appreciate what he brings too. He's a young, exciting prospect at just 26 years old. But that's precisely what makes him exciting for another organization potentially looking to take a chance. If you can showcase what he accomplished in that small sample size and emphasize his age and team control remaining, Why wouldn't another team take a shot at acquiring Loperfido? In return, because he's got so much controllable time left, maybe you're looking at a bullpen arm that we desperately still need. We absolutely still need to flesh out that bullpen with reliable arms. Or maybe another prospect who has a slightly longer timeline to reach the major leagues so that when he's ready, there'll actually be a roster spot available for him. I wouldn't hate that approach at all. Just think for a second about these numbers in a small sample size with exciting production, but nothing to absolutely hang your hat on long term. Now imagine those same characteristics, but as a bullpen arm instead of a position player. You could potentially make that trade 1-for-1 and acquire somebody like that back. Would that be better for this team overall? That's worth serious consideration. If they didn't want to move on from Joey Loperfido because maybe they like him for the organizational future and value all that team control, you could certainly make arguments for moving other names like Nathan Lukes, David Schneider, or Miles Straw instead. Nathan Lukes, to me, represents a really tough evaluation. Of the 4 players we're discussing here, is he the furthest away from actually getting moved considering he's a free agent in 2031? Considering he was batting second a significant amount of the time last season, even knowing that if Kyle Tucker arrives, he's likely not starting regularly? I would say probably close to the furthest from actually being traded. It's between him and Miles Straw for different reasons. Straw has a contract attached to his name, and maybe teams don't want to absorb that financial commitment even though it represents a relatively small contract. Some organizations might be completely out on him just because of those dollars. They might not have the financial flexibility to absorb even that modest salary. But Nathan Lukes, for me, is also a player who maybe doesn't get traded because first, he is a bit older. He's 31 years old, will be 32 next season. The Blue Jays might look at this player as a valuable asset for the reasons we've discussed, where if there is an injury situation, you saw exactly what this player could do with regular playing time, and it didn't matter to him one bit. His entire career, he's been grinding through the minor leagues without consistent opportunities. What's going to change now that he's riding the bench with the Toronto Blue Jays at the major league level? He'll be happy to be there, and when his name gets called upon, he'll give you quality at-bats. He'll provide sound defense and put up decent offensive numbers. Literally an average Major League Baseball player with an OPS plus right around 100. For me, I think the Blue Jays genuinely might value him as a player rather than viewing him as a trade chip because they're going to evaluate what they'd actually get in return. Probably not a substantial return. They might prefer keeping someone like Nathan Lukes on this roster for depth purposes. But I would also argue that all those positive attributes you just mentioned represent solid selling points if you do decide to move him. The reason we're even having this conversation is because we have multiple players in that same general mold. You could make similar arguments for David Schneider. You could maybe make those arguments for Joey Loperfido, although we haven't seen it over the full sample size like we witnessed with Nathan Lukes last season. Point being, we have numerous guys fitting similar profiles, and Nathan Lukes was phenomenal down the stretch last year. That could be a major selling point for another organization. For me, I do think he might be one of the furthest from actually getting moved just because the Blue Jays saw him perform so extensively and know what he can provide. But another team saw that production as well, and maybe they're thinking we could really use that fourth outfielder role filled, and we don't currently have anyone. Nathan Lukes could actually be a relatively easy sell for Toronto. I'm not saying you're going to receive an incredible prospect haul or even a top-tier bullpen arm in return. But if you acquire Kyle Tucker and realize Lukes just isn't going to see the field regularly, and you recognize that even if one or two injuries happen, you still have David Schneider, Miles Straw, and Joey Loperfido available, maybe you seriously consider making that move. Another player we should discuss is Miles Straw potentially being traded. But again, there's that contract attached to him. He's got this year plus 2 club options remaining. It's about a $7.4 million hit to your payroll annually. But to organizations like the Pirates, the Rays, or the Athletics, that represents a pretty decent financial commitment. They don't necessarily want to spend on a player who profiles as a bench contributor right now. He can play sometimes in the outfield as a defensive replacement late in games, but Straw probably isn't looking at generating a substantial surplus in terms of return given what he provides. I'm going to push back on that assessment, though, because that 2.9 WAR last season, there's legitimate value there. That $7 million contract for somebody who produced almost 3 WAR represents pretty solid value. That was one of his second best seasons in terms of WAR production. Think about how much Toronto paid Kevin Kiermaier to come in and do essentially what Miles Straw accomplished, possibly even less production. Teams absolutely value elite defensive outfielders who can protect leads late in games. Miles Straw, for me, if you're an organization that doesn't have that defensive capability, I mean, honestly, a team like the New York Yankees, who have documented problems defensively, I think this could actually be a relatively attractive acquisition target. You're not trading for his bat, obviously. You're trading to acquire a legitimately excellent outfielder who can change games with his glove. I think teams would genuinely value that almost 3 WAR production. In terms of return for Miles Straw, considering the contract, you're not getting Mason Miller or anything crazy in that caliber. But I think you could theoretically acquire somebody like Miles Straw, but as a bullpen piece instead. Somebody who's not going to pitch high leverage innings necessarily. Maybe a middle to lower leverage innings arm who's had ups and downs in his career. Maybe he posted a 4 ERA last year out of the pen across 45 innings, but he's got solid underlying metrics and another year of team control remaining. You could make a swap like that, and I genuinely believe teams would be interested. In that scenario, though, I don't think the Blue Jays would execute that trade if that's the caliber of return they're receiving, because you have to acknowledge this was one of Straw's better seasons in a long time. He's going to be 32 next year with a contract attached. They might as well just retain him if you're not getting an impact player back in return. But do we think we're going to get a blockbuster return for any one of these depth outfielders? I think what we're realistically discussing here is trading depth in the outfield to acquire depth in the bullpen. That's the fundamental transaction framework. That's where I keep circling back to my first candidate, which was Joey Loperfido. I think he's the player you target for a trade if you're seriously looking to move someone, because the last guy on this list is David Schneider. I genuinely don't think they're trading David Schneider. That player is too much of a clubhouse presence. He had an excellent year last season. He's developed great chemistry with Addison Barger and the rest of this roster. You don't want to disrupt that dynamic. Similar situation with Miles Straw and those relationships, whereas Joey Loperfido might be slightly outside looking in on those clubhouse bonds, and he also represents a more tantalizing piece where you could potentially secure a relatively better return. If I had to choose here, yeah, I'd probably opt to trade Joey Loperfido, but that's primarily because we haven't seen enough of him yet at the major league level. What I'm evaluating here is you have 4 players who could all theoretically fill similar roster roles. I don't want to trade Schneider because I genuinely love what he brings, and he did have a pretty solid offensive season last year. Granted, small sample size again at 188 at-bats, but you felt like he figured something out offensively. Is anybody completely off the table here for the Toronto Blue Jays? I don't think so. Every single one of these players should be available right now for the right return. What's going to be better for this team if they bring in somebody like Kyle Tucker and Nathan Lukes is barely seeing the field, or Miles Straw is sitting on the bench game after game? I think I'd rather swap that asset for a middle innings bullpen arm, because when you're talking about straight depth and roster volatility, of course you want offensive depth, but I desperately want more reliable bullpen arms. That's where I believe the organizational need is most pressing right now. If you acquire one of Kyle Tucker or Bo Bichette, you could essentially run with the same core group from last year, because effectively it's just filling that one roster slot you're missing. You've got the same fundamental pieces returning. That's the question the Blue Jays need to ask themselves. You might change your evaluation if you want to promote Joey Loperfido and give him an extended look, but then you need to move one of those other players to create space. There are numerous options available, but you need to see who comes knocking with legitimate trade interest. If another team really wants to acquire Nathan Lukes or Miles Straw or Joey Loperfido, then you start seriously entertaining those offers. Could the Blue Jays realistically trade one of these players? Absolutely, they could. I think it comes down to finding the right deal at the right time. We need to wait for Kyle Tucker or Bo Bichette to sign, which could take a considerable while longer. But don't be surprised if you see a trade happen mid-February, or even early March. The Blue Jays have executed moves during that timeline in the past. The offseason isn't over, and roster construction continues right up until games start mattering. This front office needs to maximize every asset available to build the most competitive roster possible for next season.